the loose stone shifted under the crowbar with a grating sound that set Martha's teeth on edge. It was the last one along the northern foundation of the cabin, the one most exposed to the relentless winds that swept down from the ridges. Her husband, John, had always meant to properly mortar this section, but the spring planting and then the sickness had intervened. Now John was gone, and the wind had found the weakness. It whispered through the floorboards at night, a cold promise of the winter to come. Her dog, a large shepherd named Kaiser, whined softly, his head cocked as he watched her strain. The muscles in her back and arms screamed in protest, weary from a long day of chopping wood, a task that still felt foreign and punishing. With a final, desperate heave, the stone gave way, tumbling onto the dry, cracked earth. Martha straightened up, rubbing the small of her back, intending to mix a small batch of mud and straw to pack the gap. But Kaiser was already there, his nose pressed into the dark opening, his tail giving a single, uncertain thump against the ground. He began to dig, not with the playful frenzy of chasing a mole, but with a focused, urgent scratching, sending clumps of dark soil flying. "Kaiser, stop that," she commanded, her voice tired. He ignored her, digging deeper, his whining growing more intense. A strange current of air, colder than the autumn evening, washed over her ankles. It smelled not of fresh dirt, but of something ancient and undisturbed, of dust, of deep rock, of a place that had not breathed for a very long time. Curiosity overcame her exhaustion. She knelt, shooing the dog aside, and peered into the blackness. It wasn't a shallow animal burrow. It was a void, an emptiness that swallowed the fading light. She reached a hand in, her fingers brushing against not soft earth, but the cold, hard edge of a dressed plank. Wood. Buried deep under her home. Her heart began to beat a little faster. This cabin was built on land once owned by Jebediah Kane, a solitary prospector who had died a decade before she and John had even arrived. He was a local legend, a man said to have been driven mad by solitude and whispers of a gold seam he never found. He was also known for his secrecy, for guarding his small plot of land with a silent, unnerving vigilance. People said he had secrets buried with him. Martha had always dismissed it as fireside talk. Now, feeling the chill draft on her skin, a draft from a hidden, man-made space, she was no longer so sure. The wind was picking up, rattling the dry leaves in the cottonwood by the creek, and the sun had bled away behind the mountains, leaving only a bruised purple stain in the sky. Winter was coming, and she had just found a secret kept by the dead. John had been a strong man, with hands that seemed capable of turning the very earth to his will. He had cleared this land, felled the trees, and raised the walls of their small cabin with a quiet determination that Martha had loved. He saw the world as a series of straightforward problems to be solved with labor and good sense. A leaking roof required new shingles. A harsh winter required a larger woodpile. A wife's worry required a calm hand on her shoulder and the simple words, "We'll manage." We always do, but he hadn't managed the fever that took him in the spring. It had burned through him with a ferocity that defied all his strength, leaving Martha in a world that suddenly felt immense and hostile. The cabin, once a symbol of their shared dream, now felt like a wooden cage, its every creak and groan a reminder of her solitude. The community in the small settlement down in the valley was kind. Mrs. Gable had brought a stew, and Mr. Abernathy, their nearest neighbor a half-mile down the track, had offered to help mend her fence. But they all had their own families, their own fears about the coming winter. Their pity was a temporary warmth, but it wouldn't keep the fire lit in January. Her woodpile, which John would have had stacked high to the eaves by now, was pitifully small. She worked at it every day, her hands raw and blistered, but for every log she split, the shadow of the mountain seemed to stretch a little longer, the air grew a little sharper. She was 42 years old, a widow with no children, with only a loyal dog and a plot of unforgiving land to her name. Desperation was a physical thing, a cold knot in her stomach that tightened with every gust of wind against the thin cabin walls. She would lie in her bed at night, Kaiser breathing softly on the floor beside her, and listen to the sounds of the coming cold. It was in the cry of the geese heading south, in the rustle of mice seeking shelter in her walls, in the profound, aching silence where her husband's snores should have been. The winter wasn't just a season, it was an adversary, a living thing of ice and wind that was coming for her, and she had no illusions about her chances of winning. She had enough flour and salted pork to last, but warmth was life, and her supply of it was dwindling with every sunset. The next morning, driven by a gnawing unease, Martha returned to the hole. She'd spent the night tossing and turning, the memory of that cold, ancient air chasing away sleep. With Kaiser watching from a safe distance, she took a shovel and began to clear the earth around the wooden plank. It wasn't a plank, it was a door, a heavy, rough-hewn trapdoor set on rusted iron hinges. It took all her strength, leveraging the shovel against a rock, to pry it open. It lifted with a groan of protest, revealing a set of steep, narrow steps carved directly into the hard-packed earth. A wave of musty air, thick with the smell of decay and damp stone, billowed out. She fetched a lantern, its flickering flame casting dancing, monstrous shadows as she descended. The steps led into a small, box-like chamber, no bigger than a pantry. It was a root cellar, but a poor one. The walls were crumbling, and a thin layer of milky mold coated the dirt floor. Disappointment washed over her. It was just an old, forgotten cellar, probably useless. She was about to turn back when her lantern light caught something odd on the far wall, a dark, straight line that seemed too perfect to be natural. She ran her hand over it and felt the splintered edge of more wood. Behind a layer of caked-on mud and debris, there was another wall, a false one. Working with the claw end of a hammer, she pried the boards loose. They came away with a damp tearing sound, revealing another space beyond. This chamber was different. It was smaller, more deliberate. The walls were not bare earth but were lined with smooth, flat stones, fitted together with a surprising precision. And set into these walls were strange channels, like shallow gutters, made of a reddish clay that had been fired hard. They snaked down the walls and across the floor, all converging on a small, stone-lined pit in the center of the room. At the back of the chamber, a narrow, black iron pipe, no wider than her wrist, rose from the floor and disappeared up into the earthen ceiling. She followed its path with her eyes. It was a flue, expertly constructed and angled to emerge somewhere far from the cabin's foundation, likely hidden amongst the rocks of the hillside. This was no root cellar. Jebediah Kane had not built this place for storing potatoes. It was too small, too complex. The clay channels, the central pit, the hidden flue, it was a system. A machine made of earth and stone. But for what? A forge? No, it was too small, and there was no sign of soot or coal. A still? Perhaps, but the design seemed wrong. She knelt by the central pit, the lantern light glinting off the smooth clay lining. It was a firebox. The channels were meant to carry heat, to warm the stones, to let the warmth seep into the surrounding earth. He had built a heater, a subterranean furnace. He had tried to warm the very ground beneath his feet. The sheer, obsessive genius of it was chilling. This was the secret the old prospector had guarded so jealously, not gold, but warmth. A week later, a premature cold snap descended from the mountains, a sharp and vicious taste of what was to come. For 2 nights, the temperature dropped well below freezing. Martha burned through a precious tenth of her woodpile just to keep the cabin bearable. She woke on the second morning to a skin of ice on the inside of the window panes and a deep, unshakable chill in her bones. The cold was a thief, stealing the heat from the fire almost as soon as it was made, pulling it through the chinks in the walls and the cracks in the floor. That was the moment her simmering curiosity about Jebediah's cellar hardened into a desperate resolve. The memory of that intricate, underground room, its stone walls, its clever flue, was no longer just a mystery, it was a potential lifeline. She could not outwork the winter, not with an axe. She could not outendure it in this drafty cabin. But perhaps, just perhaps, she could outsmart it. She could go under it. The decision formed not as a single, clear thought, but as a slow, rising tide of certainty. She would not just use Jebediah's strange furnace, she would inhabit its warmth. She would expand the second chamber, dig it out, make it large enough for a cot, a small table, a life. She would create a burrow for herself and Kaiser, a hidden refuge insulated by the one thing she had in abundance, the earth itself. It was a mad idea. The thought of spending the winter underground like a hibernating bear was unsettling, a rejection of the sun and sky. What would people think? What would Mr. Abernathy say if he knew? He would think her mind had snapped with grief. He would try to talk her out of it, try to get the women from the town to intervene. They would see it as a surrender, a descent into madness. But Martha saw it as a calculated, strategic retreat. It was a battle, and this was her only viable fortress. She would have to work in secret, mostly at night, hiding the evidence of her excavations. The risk of discovery was great, but the risk of freezing in her own bed was greater. That evening, she took the lantern and went back down into the cold, silent dark. She stood in the stone-lined chamber, running her hands over the cool, smooth rocks. This was Jebediah's legacy. He had been a bitter, secretive man, hoarding his idea until it died with him. She would be different. First, she would use his knowledge to survive. Then, she would decide what to do with it. For now, there was only the work. She took a deep breath, the damp, earthy air filling her lungs. It did not feel like a tomb. It felt like a beginning. The labor was the hardest of her life. By day, she performed the visible chores of survival, chopping wood for the main cabin's fireplace to keep up appearances, mending clothes, tending to her dwindling flock of chickens. But as soon as dusk settled, her real work began. With Kaiser as her silent, watchful guard at the top of the steps, she descended into the earth. Her first task was expansion. Using John's old pickaxe and shovel, she began to carve away at the earthen wall opposite the entrance to Jebediah's stone chamber. The ground was brutally hard, a dense mix of clay and rock that fought her for every inch. The sound of the pickaxe striking stone was terrifyingly loud in the enclosed space, and she worked with a frantic, rhythmic intensity, constantly pausing to listen for any sound from outside. Each bucket of dirt and rock had to be hauled up the narrow steps and carried out into the darkness. She couldn't just dump it near the cabin. Mr. Abernathy had sharp eyes and would notice a fresh mound of earth immediately. So, under the faint light of the moon or stars, she carried the heavy buckets one by one to the far side of the creek, scattering the dirt amongst the dense thickets of brush where it would be washed away by the spring melt. Her back became a landscape of pain, and her hands, even protected by John's worn leather gloves, were a mass of blisters that broke, bled, and hardened into thick calluses. Some nights, she would collapse onto her cot in the cabin, too exhausted to even wash, the smell of damp earth clinging to her hair and clothes. Yet, with every cubic foot of earth she removed, the space grew, and with it, her sense of defiant purpose. She was not just digging a hole, she was building a sanctuary. Once she had cleared a space roughly 8 feet by 10, she began the painstaking process of lining it. She spent days gathering flat, heavy stones from the creek bed, loading them onto a crude wooden sledge and dragging them back to the cabin after dark. She became a creature of the night, her muscles growing lean and hard. She learned the craft of dry stacking, fitting the stones together like a complex puzzle, using a mixture of mud and clay as a crude mortar to fill the gaps. The walls rose slowly, a solid, reassuring barrier against the raw earth. She extended Jebediah's flue system, carefully building a small, stone-lined fireplace and hearth into one wall, connecting it to the original iron pipe. The engineering of it was a constant puzzle, a process of trial and error. A poorly drawing flue would fill the small space with smoke, a fatal mistake. She tested it with small, quick-burning fires of twigs, adjusting the stones and the baffling until the smoke pulled cleanly up and away. Mr. Abernathy stopped by one afternoon, his brow furrowed with concern. "You're looking tired, Martha," he said, his eye scanning her meager woodpile. "Are you keeping well?" "Just busy," she replied, her heart pounding. "Lots to do before the snow flies as you're burning your lamp late," he noted. "I see it from my porch." She forced a smile. "Long nights are good for mending," he nodded slowly, not entirely convinced, his gaze lingering on a fresh smudge of clay on her sleeve. The brief conversation left her shaken but more determined than ever. She was so close. She built a low bed frame from salvaged lumber, raising it off the floor, and brought down her thickest wool blankets and a straw-stuffed mattress. The dugout was no longer just a hole. It was a room. It was shelter. It was hope, dug from the cold, hard ground with her own 2 hands. The first blizzard arrived without subtlety. It did not creep in but fell upon the high country like a hammer blow. The sky, a placid blue at noon, turned to a leaden, bruised grey by mid-afternoon. Then the wind began to howl, a low, predatory moan that rose to a piercing shriek. The snow did not drift down in gentle flakes but was driven horizontally in a blinding, stinging torrent. Within an hour, the world outside Martha's cabin was gone, erased by a swirling vortex of white. The temperature plummeted, and the wind assaulted the small wooden structure, seeking every crack and seam. It rattled the windows in their frames and sent icy drafts snaking across the floor. The sound was deafening, a constant, violent roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the world. In years past, this would have been a moment of terror, of huddling by the fire, feeding it log after log, and praying the wood held out. But this time was different. After securing the chickens in their small, reinforced coop and ensuring the cabin's shutters were latched tight, Martha took one last look at the maelstrom outside. Then, with Kaiser pressing close against her legs, she lifted the heavy, insulated rug that now covered the trap door, lit her lantern, and descended into the quiet dark. She sealed the door above them, muffling the roar of the wind to a distant, powerless rumble. Down in her subterranean room, the air was still and cold, but it was a calm, steady cold, not the biting, invasive chill of the cabin above. She knelt at her small stone fireplace and lit the kindling. The dry wood caught quickly, and within minutes, a small, efficient fire was crackling, its smoke pulling cleanly up the flue. The transformation was immediate and profound. The little fire did not have to fight a losing battle against a large, drafty space. Its heat radiated outwards, warming the stones of the hearth, which in turn warmed the walls and the very earth around them. The small, enclosed room became a pocket of enduring warmth, a gentle, radiant heat that soaked into her bones. Kaiser, who had been shivering upstairs, curled up on a sheepskin rug near the hearth and fell into a deep, untroubled sleep. Martha sat on her simple cot, listening. The only sounds were the soft crackle of the fire and the quiet breathing of her dog. The furious, raging blizzard that was tearing apart the world above was a distant rumor, a story being told somewhere far away. The earth was her shield. It absorbed the wind's fury, its deep, primal mass insulating her from the lethal cold. She had a small store of dried meat, biscuits, and water in a corner, enough for a week if need be. She had a stack of neatly cut, dry firewood that would last for days in her efficient little hearth. She was not just surviving the storm, she was living peacefully in its heart. For the first time since John's death, the knot of fear in her stomach loosened. She had not been conquered by the wilderness. She had simply burrowed beneath its grasp. The blizzard raged for 3 days. On the 4th morning, Martha awoke to an unfamiliar sensation, silence. The wind had died. The world above had fallen still. Cautiously, she unsealed the trapdoor and pushed it open. A cascade of fine, powdery snow fell down the steps. The cabin was dark, the windows completely obscured by massive drifts. And it was colder than a tomb, the air so frigid it hurt to breathe. A thick layer of frost coated every surface. Any embers in the upstairs fireplace had died 2 days ago. Had she remained up here, she would have been in a desperate, life-threatening situation, likely burning her furniture to stay alive. After clearing the steps, she put on her heaviest coat and pushed against the main cabin door. It wouldn't budge. The snow was piled against it, feet deep. She had to use her shovel as a lever to force it open a crack, then spent the next hour clearing a narrow path to the outside. When she finally emerged, the world was a revelation. It was stunningly beautiful and utterly hostile. The snow was piled in monstrous, sculpted drifts, burying fences and bushes, transforming the familiar landscape into a pristine, alien terrain. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue, and the air was so clear and cold that the distant peaks seemed close enough to touch. There was no sign of life, no track of animal or man. She checked on the chickens, who were alive but subdued in their buried coop, and then began the arduous task of digging out. As she worked, a figure appeared on the rise, a dark shape struggling through the deep drifts. It was Mr. Abernathy, on snowshoes, his face etched with worry. "Martha," he called out, his voice thin in the vast silence. "Thank God. I saw no smoke from your chimney." I feared the worst. He finally reached her, breathing hard, his beard crusted with ice. He glanced at the cabin, at the snow-clogged chimney. "How did you stay warm? You must have frozen in there." Martha's heart hammered against her ribs. The moment of revelation was upon her, whether she wanted it or not. "I was warm enough, William," she said, her voice steady. He frowned, his gaze sweeping over her. She was not haggard or frostbitten, her cheeks were rosy, and she moved with a vigor that belied the ordeal. He looked back at the cold, dead chimney, then at her, and the suspicion he'd held for weeks sharpened into outright confusion. "How?" he asked again, more forcefully. "There's no magic in these hills, Martha. You haven't had a fire in that cabin for days." She held his gaze, knowing that lies were useless now. She gestured with her shovel toward the cabin. "Not in that fireplace, no." She led him inside, into the frigid air of the main room, and pointed to the thick rug on the floor. William Abernathy watched, his mouth agape, as she pulled it aside to reveal the trapdoor. The faint, unmistakable smell of wood smoke and a gentle wave of warmth rose from the opening. "In God's name," he whispered, staring into the darkness below. "What have you done?" She lit a lantern and led him down the steps. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, a low whistle of astonishment escaped his lips. He took in the scene, the neatly stacked stone walls, the simple cot, the small, glowing embers in the stone hearth, and Kaiser thumping his tail in greeting from his sheepskin rug. The air was warm and dry, a pocket of impossible comfort hidden beneath the frozen ground. He ran a hand over the stone wall, his practical farmer's mind struggling to comprehend the simple, profound ingenuity of it all. "It's a dugout," he breathed. "But how?" Martha explained everything, her voice calm and measured. She told him about the loose foundation stone, the discovery of the old root cellar, and the hidden second chamber built by Jebediah Kane. She described the strange clay channels and the flue, showing him how she had deduced its purpose. Then she told him of her own labor, the weeks of secret digging, of hauling stones from the creek, of the trial and error in building the fireplace so it would draw smoke properly. She left nothing out, detailing the back-breaking work and the constant fear of discovery. Jebediah had the idea, she concluded, stirring the embers with a stick. But he kept it to himself. "I think his bitterness kept him colder than any winter ever could. He built this for one person, and I suspect it failed him in the end. A place this small needs tending. It needs a life in it." Abernathy was silent for a long time, his gaze moving from the hearth to the sturdy walls, to Martha's face, illuminated by the firelight. He saw not a mad, grieving widow, but a woman of formidable strength and intelligence. He thought of his own family, of the 2 young children who had been huddled under every blanket they owned for the past 3 days. He thought of his neighbor's infant, and the elderly couple in town who lived in the draftiest house of all. "You survived the blizzard," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "No, you did more than that. You lived through it." He looked at her then, a deep and profound respect dawning in his eyes. He saw the genius not just in the design, but in the will behind it. Unlike the prospector who had hoarded his secret, Martha was now sharing it with him, her closest, most suspicious neighbor. The contrast was not lost on him. Jebediah had dug a tomb for his secrets. Martha had built a womb of survival. "This knowledge," he said slowly, "this could save people, Martha. This could change everything for us up here." "I know," she replied simply. "That's why I'm showing you, William. A fire meant for one person is a lonely thing. It doesn't give enough heat." When spring finally broke and the great thaw began, the story of Martha's dugout spread through the valley. Mr. Abernathy, a man whose words carried weight, told the tale with a reverence that silenced any doubters. He described the warmth, the cleverness, the sheer grit of the woman they had all pitied. Curiosity turned to respect, and respect turned to practical interest. That summer, the sound of pickaxes striking rock echoed in the hills. Guided by Martha, several families began excavating their own winter rooms. She shared her knowledge freely, holding nothing back. She explained the importance of choosing the right spot, away from the water table, on a gentle slope that would allow for proper drainage. She showed them how to construct the flue for a clean draw, emphasizing that a smoky cellar was more dangerous than a cold cabin. She taught them the art of fitting stone and the patience required for the slow, arduous work. It was not a simple process, and success was not guaranteed. The Abernathy family, with William's meticulous nature, created a dugout even larger and more stable than Martha's, a testament to his hard work. They finished it before the first frost, their confidence for the coming winter a palpable thing. But the Johnson family, eager and impatient, dug too deep and too close to the creek. The first heavy autumn rain flooded their efforts, turning their winter room into a muddy, useless pit. Another family, the Pattersons, skimped on the stone lining, believing the hard-packed earth was enough. A section of their ceiling collapsed during a mild tremor, a stark reminder that there were no shortcuts. These failures were as important as the successes. They taught the community that this was not a miracle solution, but a craft. It required understanding the land, respecting the principles of heat and air, and investing the relentless labor it demanded. Martha became an unlikely teacher, a quiet authority on the art of living with the land instead of merely on it. She walked from homestead to homestead, advising on placement, inspecting the stonework, and offering quiet encouragement. She was no longer the widow, an object of pity and charity. She was Martha, the woman who had burrowed into the earth and emerged with a gift for them all. The community, once a collection of isolated families bracing for winter alone, began to work together, helping one another haul stones and offering advice learned from their own mistakes. The secret of a bitter old man had been transformed into a shared project, a communal bulwark against their common enemy, the cold. Years passed. The seasons turned, each winter seeming a little less daunting than the last. Martha lived a long and quiet life in her small cabin, her winters spent in the warm, secure embrace of the earth she had shaped. She never remarried, finding a different kind of companionship in the deep respect of her community and the unwavering loyalty of Kaiser, and then Kaiser's descendant, a steady presence at her hearth. The practice of building Martha's cellars, as they came to be known, became a local tradition, a piece of vernacular architecture born of desperation and ingenuity. The most successful ones were passed down through generations, improved and expanded, becoming integral parts of the homesteads. Children grew up with stories of the Great Blizzard and how Martha had ridden it out in her warm burrow while others nearly froze. The failures served as cautionary tales, reinforcing the lessons of patience and respect for the forces of nature. The legacy of Jebediah Kane faded into nothing more than a name on an old land claim, a footnote about a reclusive prospector who died alone. He had possessed a brilliant idea, a key to survival in this harsh land, but his secrecy had rendered it useless. He had clutched his knowledge so tightly that it had died in his grasp. His hollow under the ground was a monument to the futility of individual ambition when pitted against the overwhelming power of the wilderness. Martha's legacy, however, was written in stone and earth all across the valley. It was in the wisp of smoke rising from a hidden flue on a cold day, in the faces of children kept warm through a blizzard, in the shared labor of neighbors helping neighbors. She had taken a dead man's secret and given it life by giving it away. Her true innovation was not the dugout itself, but the understanding that knowledge, like fire, grows brighter and warmer the more it is shared. It cannot be hoarded. In the end, it was a simple truth: one person digging a hole can create a grave, but a community digging together can build a foundation for the future.